Hello and welcome back to my channel. I thought I would do something a little bit different today. I've been playing quite a bit of OnAir Airline Manager. It's sort of like a career mode add-on for Microsoft Flight Simulator as well as other flight simulators. And I thought I would go through my top 10 tips and tricks for career mode and survival mode, which is among the more difficult of the options that they have listed. So I'm going to go through, some of them are really quick, really simple, and I think some of them are going to get a little bit more in-depth, busting out some spreadsheets here. So hopefully you find something here that you find interesting or will help you play. So the first thing, so I guess backing up here, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here is I think mostly geared towards AI pilots, so kind of building your company and not so much the flying inside the game. But I think some of these will be applicable to all scenarios. So the first one is making sure that whatever airport you're flying to has gas. So just taking Mi-56 here as an example, if we take a look at it, you'll notice that there is no 100 LL fuel here, so any of the piston aircraft cannot refuel here. I know that when I was starting off playing, I found myself several times at airports that did not have enough fuel, or that didn't have any fuel, and I couldn't refuel. And at one point I had to bring fuel containers to that airport to refuel the aircraft. So it's something I check now. Whenever I fly to an airport, I make sure that it either has the fuel I need to refuel when it comes time to leave the airport, or I make sure I take enough fuel with me for the trip that I can leave after I'm done with the mission. So number 2 is along the same lines of just making sure you plan ahead. So here I'm looking for a pretty big mission, carrying a lot of weight, long distance, and find one here that looks really good, lots of money, and I come over here and I look and see that the destination airport is only a size 3 airport, and a lot of the big planes need at least size 4 or bigger. So just make sure when you take your missions, you know that the airports that you're going from and to can handle the size of airplane that you'd like to do the mission. I pulled up the aircraft details here for the Microsoft Flight Simulator 787, and you can see here that it needs a minimum airport size of 4, so those would be either the blue or green airports. So just something to make sure that you're aware of before you start taking missions that might be much more difficult to accomplish if you can't land there. And then sort of maybe 2.5 here, don't forget that you can break up missions, so you can bring cargo in a big plane to a large airport and take smaller planes and take that cargo and deliver it to the smaller airports. So you don't have to do, you don't have to use just one plane to finish a mission. You can kind of use hubs and break apart the cargo and use smaller planes to distribute the cargo to smaller airports if you need to. So item number 3 is a big one, and I think this one is going to be really important if your goal is to grow your company and make money, and you want to rent aircraft for a while. So the thing to really keep in mind with renting aircraft is that it is very expensive to rent them, especially the bigger the airplane that you're trying to rent. And so I'm looking at a mission here that's available from Los Angeles. It looks like it pays a lot of money, almost $4.5 million if you complete it, but it's 7,000 miles away. So if I flip over here to this spreadsheet, and I'll go through this in a minute, but basically what you can find out, you can do the math to figure out how much it costs to rent and operate an aircraft per mile. And so this mission here that we're looking at is 7,000 miles away. The cargo is roughly 80,000. So if we wanted to use our 787 from Microsoft Flight Simulator to fly that, it's going to cost about $580 a nautical mile to operate that airplane. And I'll go through these calculations in a minute, and I'll go through this sheet here as well. But what we find is if we have a mission, how far was it again? 7,172 miles. So I calculate that to be, it's almost $4.2 million to operate the plane, and the payout here is only $4.4 million. So really, this is not that great of a mission to take if you're planning on using the 787 to fly it. The really key factor when you're looking at flights, when you're looking at missions, if you want to try to make money, is really to look at the distance. Yeah, you want to make sure that the cargo will fit into the plane, but really the key driver if you're renting aircraft is the distance. You really need to make sure that you're taking a look at the distance and the pay and making sure that it's worth it. Because 4.4 million looks like it's a lot of money here, but really you're going to be paying almost every bit of that to rent the aircraft for that flight. So coming over here, and I'll kind of walk through what I've done here. I've got a few of the Microsoft Flight Simulator or the planes, sorry, listed out here, and a few of the key parameters that you need to figure out how much it costs to actually operate the plane. You need the speed, you need how much it costs to rent per hour, and you need its fuel flow per hour. And you can find all of that in the game. If I come over here and look for an aircraft, if I'm looking to rent an aircraft, the rental price, I'm just taking sort of a representative number here. You can see they kind of range from 76 to 79,000. So I picked I picked 70. I found some cheaper ones before, so I had put 74,000 here. But you can adjust that number as you want. And then the other values you can find on the aircraft page here. So the speed is up here, the design cruise speed of 402 knots, and that's what I've got here. And then the fuel flow in pounds per hour of 6216, and we'll flip back here to OnAir, the 6216 there. So basically the cost to operate a plane that you're renting are the fuel, the pilots, and the aircraft rental itself. The fuel I've got calculated here at roughly $4 to $5 a gallon, depending on what type of gas it is. It might be a little bit higher than that depending on what airport you're at. So let's take a look at the A320 here. So I'm calculating it to be $4 a gallon, and then what I want is pounds, not gallons, so I'm dividing it by 6 roughly to get the dollars per pound. So you can do the math here, and basically you take the fuel flow that you get from the aircraft sheet, and you're dividing it by the speed of the plane, and you're multiplying it by the price per pound, and then you get the price per mile for gas, which is about $10. The pilots, I roughly estimate it to be about $200 per. It's $200 an hour for 2 pilots, roughly, and then divided by the speed gets you the cost for the pilots per mile. And then for the rent over here per mile, it's the rent per hour divided by the speed. And so what you can see here, and I've got the pie charts out here, when you're renting a plane, almost the entire cost of operating the plane is the rental, and that which is not is the fuel. So, and that's true for the bigger planes. I've also got like the Cessna 172 here, and you can see that the rent is still a big portion of it, the rent being in the orange here, but the pilot and the fuel do matter more, but still the rent is a big piece of that. So kind of one takeaway from this is it doesn't matter what I put for the gas price, it doesn't matter what you put for the pilot cost, it's really all in the rent of the plane. And so you get a figure over here, if you do all that math, of how much it costs to operate the plane per mile. And that's why when you're looking at the missions, it's important to look at the mileage to make sure that you are making enough money to overcome the cost of the rental. And I will talk about this sheet more a little bit later, but basically what I've done here is a calculation of, you can put the range in here, and then you can determine how much it costs to fly that route, roughly, if you multiply the range by the cost, that cost that we calculated on the other sheet. So it's just the dollars per mile times the mileage. So for a 1,300 mile flight for the A320, it costs about $250,000 to operate. So with number 4, I'm moving on to talking about hiring pilots and why I'm recommending using freelance pilots more often than not. As I demonstrated before, unless you're using really small planes, the cost of the pilot does not matter. And the pilots in the game, unless you're disabling the option, but I'm talking primarily about career mode and survival mode here, the pilots need to rest and they've got downtime after they fly on a flight. So if your planes are not flying, they're not making you money. And so hiring freelance, once you're done with a long flight, hiring a new set of freelance pilots to fly the plane is probably the most profitable way about going about this. You can hire freelance pilots to fly the plane for whatever their 8 or 9 hours. Once they're done, hire new pilots at the location of where the airplane's currently at, and then you can just keep flying the plane. If you're using employees that you've hired and not done freelance, but you've actually hired them, you either need to try to get them back to their home airports, or if you want them to stay with the plane, that means that plane is not going to be operable and the plane's not making money. And a little bit later I'll talk about like chaining future work orders, and I'll talk more about why I think the freelance pilot is a pretty good option for that as well. Number 5 is a pretty short one. I talk about you really want to make sure that you are profitable with the planes that you're renting, especially if you're trying to build up your company. And this doesn't apply later on when you start actually owning your own planes, but 2 things to keep in mind when you are renting an airplane is that your airplane rental, whenever you land, it's going to charge you the rental fee for however long you were in the air for that flight. And if you have a multi-leg flight that you're delivering, if you have a big mission and you're delivering to multiple locations, you don't get paid for the mission until you're done delivering for all of those airports. But you're going to end up paying the rent the first time you land, or every time you land at an airport. So you want to make sure you have enough money in your bank account to pay for the rental fee before actually getting the mission or payment. So just something to keep in mind. And then the other thing to keep in mind if you're playing on survival mode, the big jets especially have rent even when you're not using them. So there's a minimum rental fee of 8 hours of rent. I think it's 8 hours of rent per day. So if you're not using the plane for a day, you're still paying 8 hours of rent on it, which is quite a significant amount of money. So you want to make sure that your planes are either flying or you're returning them if you're not using them. Next up, number 6 is loans. If you're trying to quickly build your company up, I recommend that you take the loans as much as you can. You can take up to $10 million in loans, but you can't take it all at once. I think it's something along the lines of you can only get as much in loans as you have in assets or something like that. I don't know the exact equation, but if you go to the loans, it'll show you whatever loans you have available. And the weekly payment rate that you owe on the loans is really pretty trivial if you're running missions pretty often. So you really start making money once you get into the little bit bigger plane. It was once I got to the King Air sized plane that I really started making some money. But to get to that point, I needed to get the loans. So that it just kind of starts to snowball. If you have the money, then you can rent the bigger planes, and they make more money, and then you can get more loans and rent even bigger planes. So if you're interested in working your way up to the bigger planes as quickly as possible, I recommend you take as many loans as you can within the game, and that way you can get the bigger planes as soon as possible. So tip number 7, this kind of is a summary of a few of the other ones I've talked about, but I think there's a big advantage to buying your planes as quickly as possible. When you're renting planes, when you're looking at the missions, you really have to be looking for your profitability for the range. But once you own the plane, that's not nearly as important. The cost of ownership, I didn't do the math here on the spreadsheet, but the cost for actually owning a plane is much less than renting the plane, and you don't feel like you're kind of racing against the clock, making sure that you're making enough money in missions to cover your rental payment each day. Once you own the plane, you're paying much less money on it, and it frees you up to take missions that might work better in terms of the destination. Like if you've got some hubs set up, you are more free to pick the missions that you want and are less limited based on making sure that you are taking missions that are profitable enough to cover the rental fee. One other big perk about buying planes is that you can reconfigure them. And so when you buy the plane, if you really only want to do, say, cargo routes, you can rip out all the passenger seats from the plane, and the plane can carry a lot more cargo. So it's a nice perk if you own the planes to be able to do that. So tip number 8, I recommend that you have a calculator similar to what I've got here. When you're looking at what missions to take, it's really helpful to know if the plane that you've got can take the cargo that you're looking to take a certain distance. So this works for the AI players. All of this that I've been talking about is generally applicable to all flights, but mostly to AI. And I say that because some of the planes have such low cruising speeds in the game. So like the 787 for the Microsoft Flight Simulator version of it has a cruise speed of 307 knots, which is very slow. And I think in game the actual like cruising speed, like ground speed, is more along the lines of 450 knots. So if you're actually flying the plane in the game, a lot of these calculations go out the window. But if you're using the AI players, then it limits the speed to 307 knots. So just something to keep in mind. But the calculation I've got here, all of these values in yellow you can get from the except for the operating cost, which I talked about how to get that earlier. But the other values here you can get from the airplane data sheet. So I've pulled up the A320 sheet, and again, you got the 402 knots here for cruise speed. You got the fuel flow of 6216. Fuel capacity I have in pounds, which is the fuel capacity of 7,000 gallons times 6.7. The maximum payload is listed here. Your crew weight, sorry, I keep clicking. The crew weight, they assume 190 pounds per crew, and you need 2 to operate something like the A320, so that's 380. And then the operating cost we talked about before. I calculate 3 different intermediate values here, the maximum range, and the maximum range is listed here on the sheet as 3030. But some planes can't actually meet their maximum practical range because they can't carry enough fuel to do it. So the way I calculate it here is the cruise speed times the fuel capacity divided by the fuel flow. You also need its maximum actual payload, which is just its maximum payload minus the crew weight. And then you need the payload at max range, which is the payload it can take if it wants to travel at its maximum range, which is just equal to the maximum actual payload minus its fuel capacity. So assuming it's totally loaded in fuel, how much payload does it have left? So once you calculate those 3 things, you can come down here to where there's the flight parameters based on range. So the orange boxes are input that you give it. So if you want to travel, say, 1,300 miles, I already talked about how to calculate the cost of the flight. That's just the mileage times the operating cost. The duration of the flight is helpful if you're doing like work order planning and trying to figure out how long it's going to take for a crew to be on duty. And if you're trying to get another plane to take the cargo from the plane, then you need to know how long it is until the plane gets to its destination airport. But to calculate that, you're just taking the range divided by the speed. And I add half an hour just to account for things like taxiing and arrival and departure time. It's a rough estimate, but it seems to work pretty well. And then the most important part of this is the calculating how much payload you can take for that range. And you can see the equation up here. I'll just quickly run through it, but it's 1 minus the range divided by the maximum range multiplied by the maximum actual payload minus the payload at maximum range, and these are all things that we already calculated, and then adding on the payload at maximum range. And so what's helpful is if you need to travel 2,200 miles, then you know that you can carry about 41,000 pounds. If you want to travel just 1,000 miles, you can see that you can actually carry more weight. And this is because the farther you go, the more fuel you need, and that fuel is taking up weight that the payload that you can't take payload for. If you want to travel its maximum range of 3033, you'll find that you can carry 28,110, which is pretty close to the payload at maximum range that we calculated before. You can also do the flip side of this. If you know how much payload you want to carry, you can see what range you can go. So if we want to carry 25,000 pounds, well, that's a bad example. Let's do 45,000 pounds. So if you want to carry 45,000 pounds with an A320, it can go 1,941 nautical miles. The equation for this is a little bit more complicated. You have a few if statements. Basically what you're doing is you're saying that if your payload is less than your payload at maximum range, then you can travel your maximum range. If it is greater than your maximum actual payload, then you can't go at all. Then it's 0. You can't go anywhere. Otherwise, if it's between those, then you can see the equation here. It's you got some parentheses here. It's 1 minus the desired payload minus the payload at maximum range divided by the maximum actual payload minus the payload at maximum range, and then all of that multiplied with the maximum range. And you can pause it and see the equation and see the columns here if you want to try to recreate that on your own. The long story short here of what I'm getting at is it's really helpful when you're going to look at the missions that you're trying to pick, trying to determine if you can even do it. Like if you're trying to determine if you can take on a 60,000 pound payload with an Airbus A320 and it's 5,000 miles away to take it, you can do it, but you're going to be stopping a lot for fuel. So it's handy to know. Mission selection is so important, especially when you're renting. That having a calculator like this is pretty important. Alright, tip number 9 is FBOs, or fixed basis of operation. You can build FBOs as long as, let me pull it up here, in the skill tree you need FBO agreement, which is right here. As soon as you get that, you can build FBOs, and I recommend that you do that, or at least play around with it. So the way you do that is you click on an airport, or you can, however you want to get to the airport sheet, just get to the airport sheet here for the airport you want to build an FBO at. And then come over here to create an FBO. And then from here, you don't really even have to do anything except for really nothing. You can add cargo hangars, you can add fuel tanks, crew rooms, and all of these things are useful. The fuel tanks, for example, you can build fuel tanks and buy fuel at wholesale prices so that you can refuel your plane for cheaper at your base. Aircraft hangars and tie downs can get rid of or reduce the cost for parking airplanes at the airport overnight. Crew rooms, if you aren't using freelancers, your pilots will need to have hotel rooms at airports that aren't their home base. But if you have crew rooms, you don't have to pay that. And then cargo hangars, same as the aircraft hangars, but cargo that's sitting at an airport doesn't, it either doesn't have any charges or it's reduced charges, but you can use that for that as well. But the real nice part about having an FBO, and I'll show it to you as soon as I make one here, is you can go to your FBOs for your company and you can manage it. And you get these logistics queries, which let's say I wanted to generate me missions to the east that are less than 3,000 miles long, that give me cargo up to 60,000, and it's going to go to airport size 2 and larger. So I'll save that. And so I'll have these missions that then are generated every so often, and depending on the level that you have in the skill tree, you get more of the missions and they refresh quicker. But these are missions that are just for you to be able to select, because the ones from the logistics center are for anybody on the server, but the FBO ones are just for you, and sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not, but this is actually a pretty good mission here. It kind of varies, your mileage may vary with how good these missions are, but it's a pretty cheap way to generate some more missions for you at airports that you want to focus at. One more note about FBOs that I want to point out, the larger planes I talked about earlier can only land at larger airports. And so if you're going to have an FBO, let's say here in Iceland, and you want to make it here at the large airport at Keflavik, that's great. But just keep in mind that if there are weather issues, a diversion for your plane, there's no other size 4 or 5 airports here in Iceland. So you're going to have to make sure that you take enough fuel every time you go to your hub, your FBO, that you can make an alternate airport. I'm not sure what the closest one here is. It might be over here in Greenland. There's a bigger airport, or it might be back It's probably back over here in Scotland somewhere. So just something to keep in mind when you're determining where to have a hub or an FBO for larger airplanes. Making sure that you've got some alternate locations around, if that's something that's important to you. Just making sure you've got larger airports around to be able to handle diversions based on weather might be something to keep in mind. Having said that, having a stopover here in Iceland might be nice to have fuel tanks for, if you're trying to do long flights over from the Americas over to Europe and Asia. And then tip number 10 is just making sure that you utilize the work order function and chaining work orders. So I talked about using Freelance Pilots. You can get missions. So let's say that my plane here right now is in Sacramento. Let's say I pick up a mission that takes me out to Salt Lake City. I can take that mission, I can create a work order for my AI pilot to go fly that, and then let's say it's the end of their shift. I can actually go hire a new freelance pilot right now in Salt Lake City, have them sit in Salt Lake City, and then from there you can make a new work order. You can make as many work orders in a row, I think, as you want. I haven't found a limit yet. And just set its time to start when the plane is ready to begin its next mission. So like, for example, like I just said, I'm in Sacramento and I'm going to have a flight to Salt Lake City. I might have another flight and another mission ready to go with a new freelance pilot in Salt Lake City, and maybe they're going to take a trip to Denver and then on to Chicago. And you can chain these together so that you don't have to constantly keep managing your fleet every day or every how many ever hours. You could the freelancers you can hire for up to 3 days, and so you could effectively have your plane just going automatic for up to 3 days, just running missions that you've already selected, and you don't have to do a whole lot of management with it that way. So hopefully you found some of these tips helpful. I think the biggest thing to take away from this, that the thing that really helped me when I learned it was understanding how much it costs to rent planes and how it's really based on the mileage that you're traveling with those planes, and making sure that the mission reward covers the cost of renting the plane. And really you want it to be more than just cover it, like you're trying to make a profit on it. So making sure that you're picking good missions that meet that criteria is important. So again, hopefully you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and looking forward to the next one.